Billionaire marries a homeless woman for a bet, but what he discovers on the wedding night shocks him. Before we dive into the story, share in the comments where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. A billionaire stood in the spotlight of his extravagant life, surrounded by wealth and influence, believing he had everything he could ever need. But his arrogance would lead him to a life-changing moment he never saw coming. Nathan Greer, a confident and cold-hearted billionaire, was at the peak of his game. At one of his high society parties, his best friend, Michael Stokes, approached him with a smirk and a drink in hand. Michael loved pushing Nathan's limits, and tonight was no exception. "You always say money can buy anything, Nathan," Michael began, swirling his glass of wine. "But I bet even your money couldn't transform someone like her into your world." Nathan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Someone like who?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Michael pointed to a figure sitting on the street below, a young woman huddled on the sidewalk, her clothes worn, and her gaze heavy with exhaustion. She looked out of place in their opulent world, a stark contrast to the luxury around them. "I'll bet $2 million you can't marry her, turn her into a high society lady, and stay married to her for 3 months, Michael challenged, a teasing smile playing on his lips. Nathan laughed, sipping his champagne. "You clearly underestimate me, Michael," he said with confidence. "Consider it done." Without hesitation, Nathan approached the woman on the street. Her name was Emma. She barely looked up as he introduced himself, her face wary. She had every reason to be suspicious. Life had taught her to trust no one. But when Nathan mentioned money, her defenses wavered. Hunger and desperation forced her to listen. "I'll pay you generously," Nathan said. "All you have to do is marry me for 3 months. No strings attached." Emma's eyes filled with disbelief. "You must be joking," she replied, her voice trembling. "Why me?" Nathan's response was cold and calculating. "Because you're here." Emma didn't trust him, but the temptation of stability, a chance to escape the streets, was overwhelming. Reluctantly, she agreed, knowing this decision would change her life forever. Nathan escorted Emma into his sleek black car, its glossy surface reflecting the dim streetlights. She hesitated before stepping inside, her instincts warning her against this strange arrangement. But hunger and desperation silenced her doubts. As the car pulled away, Emma stared out the window, watching the city blur into darkness. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, and her heart raced with unease. Nathan broke the silence, his voice calm but laced with authority. "Relax. You'll have food, clothes, and a place to stay. You won't regret this." Emma turned to him, her voice sharp. "You think money can solve everything, don't you?" Nathan smirked. "It usually does." The tension hung thick in the air as they arrived at a luxurious hotel. Nathan guided Emma through the grand lobby, the opulence overwhelming her. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the polished marble floors gleamed underfoot. She felt out of place, shrinking under the gaze of the well-dressed guests. They entered the suite, an expansive room filled with elegant furnishings and a breathtaking view of the city. Emma stood frozen near the doorway, unsure of how to proceed. Nathan motioned for her to sit, but she remained standing. "Room service will bring food shortly," he said, loosening his tie and pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "In the meantime, you should clean up. There's a bathroom over there." Emma's gaze darted to the door he pointed to, but she didn't move. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. Nathan sipped his drink, his expression unreadable. "Let's just say it's a personal project." Emma crossed her arms, refusing to be dismissed so easily. "That's not an answer." Nathan met her eyes, his confidence unwavering. "You'll understand soon enough. For now, just follow my lead." Minutes later, a knock at the door signaled the arrival of room service. Platters of gourmet dishes were wheeled in, the aroma making Emma's stomach growl. Despite her wariness, she couldn't resist. She ate quickly, the taste of the food overwhelming her senses. Nathan watched her intently, his gaze analytical. "Tomorrow we'll get you some new clothes and clean you up properly. Then we'll get married." Emma nearly choked on her food. "Married? Tomorrow?" "Yes," Nathan replied matter-of-factly. "It's just a formality. The sooner we start, the sooner this arrangement ends." Emma set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. She stared at him, a mix of disbelief and resentment swirling inside her. She was stepping into a world she didn't understand, tied to a man who saw her as little more than a pawn. But the promise of stability and the chance to escape her dire circumstances kept her from walking away. As the evening wore on, Nathan left her alone in the suite. Emma sat on the edge of the plush bed, staring out the window at the sprawling city below. She felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Tomorrow her life would change forever, for better or worse. The next morning, Emma awoke to a soft knock on the suite door. A hotel staff member entered with a breakfast tray and a neatly folded set of clothes. Emma glanced at the items, hesitant. The clothes were finer than anything she had ever owned, soft fabrics in neutral tones that seemed tailored for her. "Mr. Greer instructed us to provide you with these," the staff member said before leaving her alone. Emma's gaze lingered on the clothes before she finally stood up, her legs still unsteady. She showered, the warm water washing away the grime of the streets, and dressed in the new outfit. She caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror and hardly recognized herself. For the first time in years she looked presentable. When she emerged, Nathan was waiting in the sitting area, scrolling through his phone. He glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Better," he remarked. "Now eat. We have a busy day ahead." Emma hesitated but sat at the table, where an array of breakfast items awaited her. She ate in silence, her mind racing with questions. What kind of man orchestrated something like this? What was his true motive? And why had she agreed to it? Nathan broke the silence. "Once we're done here, we'll head to the courthouse for the ceremony. After that, we'll go to my estate." Emma paused, her fork hovering midair. "Just like that?" No explanation, no details about what happens next. Nathan leaned back in his chair, his tone cool and detached. "The details are simple. You'll live in my house for 3 months. You'll attend a few events with me. In return, you'll have everything you need: money, clothes, food, and a chance to start over when this is all done. It's a straightforward arrangement." Emma's chest tightened. "And if I decide to back out?" Nathan's gaze hardened. "You won't. You agreed to this. There's no going back now." His words stung and Emma's appetite disappeared. She pushed her plate away and sat back, her arms crossed. "You think you can control everything, don't you?" Nathan smirked. "I don't think it, I know it." The tension between them was palpable, but Nathan didn't give her time to respond. He stood and motioned for her to follow. "Let's go. We have a wedding to attend." The ride to the courthouse was silent, save for the hum of the car engine. Emma stared out the window, her thoughts swirling. She felt like a prisoner heading toward an unknown fate. Nathan, however, seemed unfazed, typing away on his phone. When they arrived, the ceremony was quick and emotionless. An impersonal judge presided over the event, and the only witnesses were Nathan's lawyer and driver. Emma's hands trembled as she signed the marriage certificate, her name now tied to his. Nathan barely glanced at her as he said, "Congratulations, Mrs. Greer. Let's go." As they left the courthouse, Emma felt a sinking weight in her chest. She was now legally bound to a man who saw her as nothing more than a project, a wager to be won. But a small voice in the back of her mind reminded her of the promise this arrangement held, a chance to escape her past and start anew. The drive to Nathan's estate was equally quiet. Emma couldn't bring herself to ask him anything, and Nathan offered no reassurances. When the gates of the mansion came into view, her breath caught in her throat. The sprawling estate was unlike anything she had ever seen: white columns, manicured gardens, and windows that reflected the afternoon sun. As they entered, Emma was greeted by a team of staff, all standing in line as if waiting for an inspection. Nathan issued instructions with military precision, directing them to prepare a room for his new wife. Emma stood silently, taking in the grandeur and cold efficiency of her new home. This was her reality now, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into a gilded cage. That evening, Emma sat alone in the bedroom that had been prepared for her. The space was larger than any apartment she had ever lived in, adorned with luxurious furniture and rich fabrics. Despite its beauty, it felt cold and unfamiliar. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the large window that overlooked the perfectly manicured gardens. There was a soft knock on the door before it opened slightly. Nathan stepped inside, his posture relaxed yet commanding. "How are you settling in?" he asked, his tone casual, as if they were old friends instead of strangers tied by an unusual arrangement. Emma turned to face him, her expression guarded. "It's different," she admitted, her voice tinged with both awe and apprehension. "I've never been anywhere like this." Nathan smirked faintly. "You'll get used to it. This is your home for the next 3 months." Emma's stomach twisted at the reminder. "Why are you doing this?" she blurted out, unable to hold back the question any longer. "What's in it for you?" Nathan's eyes narrowed slightly as he leaned against the doorframe. "I told you, it's a personal project." "That's not an answer," Emma shot back, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "People don't just pick strangers off the street and marry them for no reason. Nathan hesitated for a moment, his confident facade faltering slightly. "Let's just say I like a challenge," he replied cryptically, avoiding her piercing gaze. "Now get some rest. Tomorrow your transformation begins." Before Emma could press further, Nathan turned and left the room, closing the door behind him. She stared at the closed door, a mixture of anger and confusion swirling within her. What kind of man orchestrated something like this? And what had she gotten herself into? The following morning, Emma was awakened early by the sound of a soft knock at her door. A housekeeper entered, carrying a tray with breakfast and a set of clothes. "Good morning, Mrs. Greer," she said politely. "Mr. Greer has asked that you join him downstairs after you're ready." Emma frowned at the title. Mrs. Greer. The name felt foreign, like it didn't belong to her. She ate quickly, the richness of the food both overwhelming and satisfying, and then changed into the outfit that had been laid out for her, a modest but elegant dress in soft tones that fit her perfectly. When she made her way downstairs, she found Nathan waiting in the expansive dining room. He was seated at the head of a long table, sipping coffee and reading the morning paper. He glanced up as she entered, setting the paper aside. "Good. You're ready," he said, standing. "Today you'll meet with a team I've hired. Stylists, etiquette coaches, and other professionals. They'll help you prepare for the events we'll attend together." Emma stiffened, her defenses rising. "So, I'm just some project for you to fix?" Nathan's expression remained unreadable. "Think of it as an opportunity. You'll be introduced to a world you've never experienced before. It's up to you to decide how you use it." Emma bit her tongue, unsure how to respond. A small part of her resented his arrogance, but another part couldn't ignore the truth in his words. This was a chance she never thought she'd have, even if it came with strings attached. Nathan stepped closer, his gaze steady. "You wanted a way out of your situation. This is it. But it won't be easy. The people in my world can be unforgiving. You'll need to prove you belong." Emma met his gaze, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "I've faced worse than your world could ever throw at me." Nathan smirked faintly, as if amused by her resolve. "We'll see." Moments later, a car arrived to take Emma to her first appointments. As she climbed into the back seat, she couldn't help but feel like she was embarking on a journey that would change her life in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Whether she would emerge stronger or broken, only time would tell. Emma's day began with a whirlwind of activities designed to overhaul every aspect of her appearance and demeanor. The car dropped her off at an upscale salon, where a team of stylists waited to begin their work. Their sharp eyes scanned her from head to toe, murmuring to each other about colors, cuts, and styles. She sat stiffly in the chair as they fussed over her hair, discussing how to modernize her look. The head stylist, a man with an air of superiority, ran his fingers through her tangled locks. "We have a lot of work to do," he said with a dramatic sigh. Emma bristled but kept quiet, reminding herself that this was part of the deal. As the scissors snipped and the hairdryer whirred, she stared at her reflection, wondering who she would see when they were finished. Next came the makeup team. They worked meticulously, layering products onto her face to create a flawless complexion. "We need something natural but polished," one of them said, blending foundation into Emma's skin. "She needs to look like she belongs but without trying too hard." Emma felt like an object on display, but she stayed silent. These people didn't know her story or what she had endured. Their judgments rolled off her like water off a stone. By the time they finished, she hardly recognized herself. Her hair was sleek and shiny, her face radiant. The clothes they chose, a tailored dress with subtle jewelry, fit her perfectly, accentuating her features without being ostentatious. Nathan arrived as the final touches were being made. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, his gaze critical but approving. "Not bad," he said after a moment. Emma glared at him through the mirror. "Glad I meet your standards." Nathan smirked. "Don't get too comfortable. This is just the beginning." From the salon, Nathan escorted her to an etiquette class. The instructor, a stern woman with impeccable posture, wasted no time in drilling Emma on the finer points of high society behavior. She corrected Emma's posture, her manner of speaking, even the way she held her utensils. Emma's frustration grew with each correction. "Do you think people really notice this stuff?" she muttered after being reprimanded for holding her fork incorrectly. "In this world they notice everything," the instructor replied sharply. "And they'll judge you for it?" Nathan watched from the corner of the room, his expression unreadable. Emma shot him a glare, but he didn't react. Instead, he approached her during a break, handing her a glass of water. "Feeling overwhelmed?" he asked, his tone surprisingly neutral. Emma shrugged. I've dealt with worse. Nathan nodded. Good. Keep that attitude. You'll need it. The day dragged on with more lessons in conversation, body language, and social cues. By the time they returned to the mansion, Emma was exhausted. Her feet ached from the heels she wasn't used to, and her head buzzed with all the rules and expectations she'd been taught. As she stepped into the mansion's grand foyer, she turned to Nathan. What's the point of all this? Is it just to prove you can win your bet? Nathan's expression shifted, his usual confidence faltering for a moment. It's more than that, he said quietly, but he didn't elaborate. Frustrated, Emma shook her head and climbed the stairs to her room. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, letting out a heavy sigh. The day had been grueling, but what weighed on her most was the question she couldn't shake. Why was Nathan doing this? As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ornate ceiling, she promised herself one thing. No matter what Nathan's true motives were, she would not lose herself in this process. She had survived far worse than him, and she would survive this too. The next morning, Emma woke up to sunlight streaming through the oversized windows of her room. The events of the previous day weighed heavily on her, but she pushed herself out of bed, determined to face whatever lay ahead. She found Nathan in the dining room, seated at the head of the long table as always. A small array of breakfast items was laid out, but his attention was focused on his phone. He barely acknowledged her as she sat down across from him. You have another busy day ahead, he said without looking up. There's an important dinner tomorrow and you'll need to be prepared. Emma raised an eyebrow. What kind of dinner? A business event, Nathan replied. High-profile guests, including some of my most influential partners. You'll be accompanying me as my wife. Emma nearly choked on her coffee. Your wife. The words felt foreign and jarring. Nathan finally looked up, his gaze calm but firm. That's what you agreed to, isn't it? Emma leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. I didn't agree to be paraded around like some trophy. Nathan smirked faintly. This is the world you've entered. You're expected to play the part. The people at this dinner will scrutinize everything, how you look, how you speak, even how you carry yourself. That's why you've been training. Emma glared at him, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. And if I mess up? What happens then? Nathan shrugged. Then they'll talk and it'll reflect poorly on me. But I don't lose. So don't mess up. His nonchalant confidence irritated Emma, but she bit her tongue. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. Fine, she said through gritted teeth. I'll play along. But don't expect me to enjoy it. Nathan's expression softened slightly, but he quickly masked it. Good. The car will take you to another round of preparation this morning. Make the most of it. Emma didn't respond, instead focusing on the plate of food in front of her. She couldn't shake the feeling that this arrangement was about more than just a bet, but Nathan was a closed book, revealing nothing. Later that morning, Emma was once again whisked away by the car. This time, the lessons were more tailored to the upcoming dinner. She was given a crash course in small talk, learning how to navigate conversations with wealthy and influential people. The instructors drilled her on how to deflect intrusive questions and project confidence, even when she felt completely out of place. By midday, Emma was exhausted, but the day wasn't over. The stylist from the previous day returned to fit her for an evening gown. The dress was stunning, deep emerald green with intricate detailing that shimmered in the light. When Emma saw herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. This will do, the stylist said, stepping back to admire his work. Now all you need is the attitude to match. Emma couldn't help but scoff. What's that supposed to mean? It means, the stylist replied with a smirk, that no matter how good you look, if you don't carry yourself with confidence, they'll see right through you. Emma stared at her reflection, his words lingering in her mind. She didn't want to care about impressing these people, but part of her realized the importance of this moment. This wasn't just about Nathan's world, it was about proving to herself that she could handle whatever life threw at her. By the time she returned to the mansion, it was late afternoon. Nathan was waiting for her in the study, sipping a glass of whiskey. He glanced up as she entered, giving her a quick once-over. How was it? He asked. Tiring, Emma replied flatly. She crossed her arms and leaned against the doorway. Are you always this controlling, or is it just with me? Nathan smirked. You're special. Emma rolled her eyes. Don't flatter yourself. He chuckled softly but didn't push the conversation further. Instead he set down his glass and stood. Get some rest. Tomorrow is important. Emma watched him leave, her mind racing with questions she didn't dare ask. She didn't trust him, not yet, but for some reason she felt like she was starting to understand him, even if only a little. That night as Emma lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that the upcoming dinner would be a turning point. Whether it was for better or worse she didn't know. But one thing was certain, she wasn't the same person who had been sitting on the street just days ago. And for the first time she wondered if she could truly navigate this strange new world. The day of the dinner arrived and Emma woke with a knot in her stomach. She spent the morning pacing her room, running through everything she had learned over the past 2 days. The etiquette lessons, the conversational drills, the hours spent perfecting her appearance, it all felt overwhelming. This wasn't her world and she still felt like an outsider pretending to belong. Mid-morning, a knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was one of the house staff holding a garment bag. "Mr. Greer asked that this be brought to you," they said before leaving. Emma unzipped the bag to reveal the emerald green evening gown she had tried on the day before. Its intricate design shimmered as the sunlight hit the fabric, and for a moment she felt a flicker of excitement. She ran her fingers over the material, marveling at its beauty, before reminding herself that this was all part of Nathan's game. Later that afternoon, Emma sat in front of a vanity as a team of stylists worked on her hair and makeup. They were meticulous, ensuring every detail was flawless. As they finished, one of them stepped back and smiled. "You're ready?" Emma stood and looked at herself in the full-length mirror. The transformation was undeniable. The woman staring back at her looked poised and confident, but inside she still felt like the same person who had been struggling to survive on the streets. Nathan was waiting for her at the bottom of the grand staircase. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, exuding his usual air of confidence. When he saw her, he paused, his expression shifting ever so slightly. "You clean up well," he said, his tone neutral but his eyes lingering a moment longer than usual. Emma descended the stairs, her movements graceful despite the heels she wasn't used to. "Let's just get this over with," she said, her voice steady. Nathan smirked. "That's the spirit." The ride to the venue was quiet, the tension between them palpable. Emma stared out the window, watching the city lights blur as they sped through the streets. She couldn't shake the feeling of being a pawn in a larger game, but she was determined not to let that show. When they arrived at the grand ballroom, Emma's breath caught. The space was opulent, with crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over the room. Waitstaff moved gracefully among the guests, offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The hum of conversation and soft strains of classical music filled the air. Nathan placed a hand on the small of her back, guiding her through the crowd. "Remember what you've learned," he whispered. "Smile, listen, and don't let them intimidate you." Emma nodded, her heart pounding as they approached a group of well-dressed guests. Nathan greeted them with ease, his charm on full display. Emma followed his lead, offering polite smiles and measured responses. The guests seemed intrigued by her, their curious glances making her feel like she was under a microscope. One woman, dressed in an elaborate gown, leaned in with a sly smile. "And how did you two meet?" she asked, her tone dripping with curiosity. Emma froze for a split second, but Nathan stepped in smoothly. "It's a story for another time," he said with a charming smile. "But I assure you it's quite the tale." The woman laughed, satisfied, and the conversation shifted to other topics. Emma breathed a silent sigh of relief, grateful for Nathan's quick thinking. Despite her nerves, she began to find her footing, engaging in small talk and even earning a few genuine smiles from the guests. As the evening progressed, Nathan kept a close eye on her, offering subtle nods of encouragement. Emma couldn't tell if it was genuine or part of his act, but she found herself relying on those small gestures to steady herself. Toward the end of the night, Emma excused herself and stepped onto a balcony overlooking the city. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the crowded ballroom. She leaned against the railing, her mind racing with everything that had happened. Nathan joined her a few moments later, holding 2 glasses of champagne. He handed one to her without a word, leaning on the railing beside her. "You did well tonight," he said after a moment, his voice softer than usual. Emma glanced at him, surprised. "Is that your way of saying thank you?" Nathan smirked. "Don't push it." She couldn't help but laugh, a genuine smile breaking through her guarded exterior. For a brief moment, the tension between them eased and she felt something unfamiliar, an inkling of camaraderie. But just as quickly she reminded herself of who Nathan was and why she was here. She straightened, her walls going back up. "Let's just hope tonight was worth it for your bet." Nathan's smirk faded, his expression unreadable. "It's not just about the bet," he said quietly, but he didn't elaborate. Emma turned back to the city lights, her heart heavy with unanswered questions. She didn't trust Nathan, but she couldn't deny that he was more complicated than she had initially thought. The drive back to the mansion was unusually quiet. Emma stared out the window, her thoughts swirling as the night's events replayed in her mind. She had managed to hold her own at the dinner, navigating conversations and deflecting questions with a grace she hadn't realized she possessed. But the experience had left her drained, and Nathan's cryptic comment about the bet still echoed in her mind. When they arrived, Nathan walked her to her room as usual. At the door, he paused, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "You surprised me tonight," he said, his voice low. "You did better than I expected." Emma raised an eyebrow, unsure if it was a compliment or a veiled critique. "I'm glad I lived up to your standards," she replied, her tone laced with sarcasm. Nathan chuckled lightly but didn't respond. Instead, he stepped back and nodded. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll talk." Emma watched him walk away, his figure disappearing down the long hallway. She closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a heavy sigh. The evening had been a test, and though she had passed, it felt like the first of many. She couldn't shake the feeling that Nathan was holding something back, something she wasn't meant to know. The next morning, Emma woke to find a note slipped under her door. It was written in Nathan's sharp, precise handwriting. "Meet me in the study at 10 a.m. We have matters to discuss." Emma frowned, wondering what matters could possibly mean. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, her curiosity growing with every step. When she entered the study, she found Nathan seated at his desk, a stack of papers spread out before him. He looked up as she entered, gesturing for her to sit. "What's this about?" Emma asked, taking the seat across from him. Nathan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I wanted to discuss the terms of our arrangement. Specifically, what happens after the 3 months are over." Emma's stomach twisted. "After 3 months I'm gone. That's what we agreed on." Nathan nodded. "That's correct. But I wanted to make sure you understand what you'll have when this is over. The financial compensation, the opportunities that will be available to you." Emma folded her arms. "Why do you care? Isn't this just about your bet?" Nathan's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might lose his composure. But when he spoke, his voice was calm. "It's about more than that. Whether you believe it or not, I want to see you succeed after this." Emma narrowed her eyes. "Why? So you can feel better about yourself? Like you're some kind of savior?" Nathan didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he pushed a folder across the desk toward her. "This is a draft of the financial arrangement we discussed. You can look it over and let me know if there's anything you want to add." Emma opened the folder, her eyes scanning the neatly typed document. The numbers were staggering, more money than she had ever dreamed of. It was enough to start over, to build a life far away from the streets she had come from. But it also came with a weight she couldn't ignore, the knowledge that it was all tied to Nathan. "This feels like a bribe," she said, looking up at him. Nathan met her gaze, unflinching. "Call it what you want. But it's yours if you stick to the agreement." Emma closed the folder and set it back on the desk. "I'll think about it," she said, her tone firm. Nathan nodded, accepting her response without argument. "Fair enough. Take the day to rest. You've earned it." Emma spent the afternoon wandering the mansion's expansive grounds. The perfectly manicured gardens and sprawling lawns were breathtaking, but they felt empty, just like the house itself. For all its grandeur, it lacked warmth, a reflection, she thought, of its owner. As she walked, her mind drifted to the events of the past few days. She couldn't deny that Nathan had been true to his word so far. He had provided her with everything he promised: clothes, food, and a place to stay. But the more time she spent with him, the more she realized how little she truly understood him. Later that evening, she found herself in the art studio, a room she hadn't noticed before. Canvases and paints were neatly arranged, and the large windows let in the soft glow of the setting sun. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, she felt a sense of calm. Picking up a brush, Emma let herself get lost in the act of painting. It was something she hadn't done in years, a part of herself she had buried under the weight of survival. The strokes came naturally, and soon the canvas began to take shape. Unbeknownst to her, Nathan stood in the doorway watching silently. He didn't say a word, but for the first time, his expression softened into something almost unrecognizable: regret, or perhaps admiration. Whatever it was, he quickly masked it and walked away, leaving Emma to her moment of peace. The next morning, Emma felt a renewed sense of purpose. Painting the night before had given her a rare moment of clarity, and for the first time, she realized she wasn't entirely at the mercy of her circumstances. Though Nathan controlled many aspects of this arrangement, she still had control over herself, and that was something she wouldn't surrender. She headed to breakfast and found Nathan already seated at the long dining table. As usual, he was engrossed in his phone, his plate of food barely touched. When he noticed her entering, he set the phone aside and gestured toward the seat across from him. "Good morning," he said, his tone neutral. "Morning," Emma replied, sitting down. She poured herself a cup of coffee and took a moment to compose her thoughts before speaking again. "About yesterday. The financial arrangement you showed me, I'm not sure how I feel about it." Nathan leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "It's straightforward. You fulfill the agreement and that money is yours. No strings attached." Emma looked at him, trying to gauge his sincerity. "But why? Why go to all this trouble for someone like me?" Nathan's expression hardened slightly, though his voice remained calm. "Because I can." She narrowed her eyes. "That's not a real answer." He smirked faintly, his usual mask of arrogance slipping back into place. "It's the only one you're getting for now." Frustrated, Emma focused on her breakfast, determined not to let him get under her skin. The conversation stalled and the room fell into an uneasy silence. Later that day, Nathan informed Emma that they'd be attending another event that evening, a charity gala. "It's less formal than last night's dinner," he explained. "But just as important. You'll need to make an impression." Emma groaned inwardly but nodded. "Fine. What's the charity for?" Nathan raised an eyebrow, seemingly caught off guard by the question. "It supports education programs for underprivileged children." Emma blinked, surprised. "That's actually a good cause?" Nathan shrugged, his voice indifferent. "Not everything I do is self-serving." She couldn't tell if he meant it, but the idea that Nathan might have layers beyond his cold exterior intrigued her. Still, she wasn't ready to let her guard down. The hours before the gala passed in a blur of preparation. By the time Emma stepped out of her room in a sleek, navy blue gown, she felt a mix of anxiety and determination. Nathan was waiting in the foyer, dressed impeccably as always. When he saw her, his gaze lingered for a moment before he offered a subtle nod of approval. "You'll do," he said, his tone teasing. Emma rolled her eyes. "Glad to know I pass inspection." Nathan smirked but didn't reply. He offered his arm and after a brief hesitation she took it. Together they walked to the waiting car. The gala was held in a grand hall, its walls adorned with art and photographs from the programs it supported. The atmosphere was lively but far less intimidating than the dinner they'd attended the previous night. Emma felt more at ease, though she was still acutely aware of the watchful eyes around her. Nathan introduced her to several guests, each interaction a delicate dance of polite conversation and veiled curiosity. Emma held her own, her confidence growing with each encounter. She found herself genuinely interested in the cause, asking questions and engaging with the organizers. At one point, a young woman approached Emma, her smile warm and genuine. "Hi, I'm Rachel," she said, extending a hand. "I run one of the programs the charity supports." Emma shook her hand, impressed by her enthusiasm. "It's nice to meet you. What kind of programs do you run?" Rachel's face lit up as she explained. "We provide after-school tutoring and mentorship for kids in low-income neighborhoods. It's amazing to see how much of a difference it makes in their lives." As Rachel spoke, Emma felt a pang of recognition. She saw herself in the kids Rachel described, struggling, overlooked, but full of potential. For a moment, she forgot about the gala, Nathan, and the strange circumstances that had brought her here. She was simply Emma, connecting with someone who understood the power of opportunity. Nathan observed the interaction from a distance, his expression unreadable. When Emma finally rejoined him, he raised an eyebrow. "You seemed invested." Emma shrugged, her tone defensive. "It's a good cause." For once, Nathan didn't offer a sarcastic remark or a cutting comment. Instead, he nodded as if acknowledging her sincerity. The car ride back to the mansion was quiet. Emma stared out the window, her thoughts racing. The gala had stirred something in her, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She didn't want to be just another face in Nathan's world, someone who existed only to fulfill his plans. She wanted more. As they pulled up to the mansion, Nathan broke the silence. "You impressed a lot of people tonight?" Emma turned to him, surprised. "Including you?" He smirked. "Don't push your luck." She laughed softly, shaking her head. Despite everything, she felt a strange sense of accomplishment. For the first time, she began to wonder if this arrangement, though far from perfect, might be the start of something she couldn't yet define. The next morning, Emma felt a quiet confidence she hadn't expected. The gala had been a small victory, a reminder that she was capable of holding her own, even in Nathan's world. As she descended the grand staircase to the dining room, she found Nathan already there as usual, engrossed in his phone. He glanced up briefly when she entered. "You're early?" Emma shrugged. "I couldn't sleep. Too much on my mind." Nathan set his phone down and studied her. "You handled yourself well last night?" Emma raised an eyebrow. "Was that a compliment?" Nathan smirked. "Don't get used to it." She rolled her eyes but couldn't hide her small smile. As much as she wanted to dislike Nathan, she found his dry humor oddly disarming. He had moments, fleeting as they were, when he seemed almost human. After breakfast, Emma decided to explore more of the mansion. The previous day she had stumbled upon the art studio, a place that had given her a rare sense of peace. Today she wanted to see what else this vast house had to offer. She wandered through hallways lined with ornate paintings and antique furniture, eventually finding herself in a library. The room was massive, with towering shelves packed with books of every genre imaginable. A ladder on wheels ran along the shelves and sunlight streamed in through tall windows, casting a warm glow over the space. Emma ran her fingers along the spines of the books, marveling at the collection. She picked one at random and settled into a plush armchair by the window. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to relax, losing herself in the pages. Meanwhile, Nathan was in his study meeting with his lawyer. The discussion was brief but important, an update on the bet that had started everything. "Are you still confident?" the lawyer asked, handing Nathan a folder. "The 3 months are halfway over." Nathan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "It's not about confidence. It's about strategy." The lawyer nodded but hesitated before speaking again. "You know, it's not too late to call this off. You've already proven your point." Nathan's jaw tightened. "It's not about proving a point anymore." The lawyer studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Understood." When the meeting ended, Nathan found himself wandering through the mansion, his thoughts unusually scattered. He wasn't sure what had shifted, but something about the past few weeks had unsettled him. Emma was no longer just a part of the bet. She had become something more, though he couldn't yet admit it to himself. Later that afternoon, Emma was back in the art studio, working on a new painting. Her brush moved instinctively across the canvas, the colors blending into a vivid sunset. The process was soothing, a welcome escape from the complexities of her situation. She was so focused that she didn't notice Nathan standing in the doorway until he spoke. "You're talented." Emma jumped slightly, turning to face him. "Do you always sneak up on people?" Nathan smirked, stepping into the room. "Only when they're so absorbed they don't hear me." Emma set down her brush and crossed her arms. "What do you want?" Nathan gestured toward the painting. "You've been spending a lot of time in here. It's the one place in this house that feels real," Emma admitted before she could stop herself. "Everything else is just too much." Nathan tilted his head as if considering her words. "You're not used to this kind of life." Emma snorted. "That's an understatement." For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of their differences hanging between them. Then Nathan surprised her by saying, "This place wasn't always like this. My mother used to paint. She turned this room into her studio." Emma blinked, caught off guard by the rare glimpse into his past. "What happened to her?" "She died when I was 12, Nathan said, his voice flat. After that, the house became more of a museum than a home. Emma studied him, her curiosity piqued. It was the first time he had shown any vulnerability, and she wasn't sure how to respond. "I'm sorry," she said finally. Nathan shrugged, his walls going back up. "It was a long time ago." He turned to leave but paused at the door. "Keep painting. You're good at it." Emma watched him go, her emotions a tangled mix of empathy and frustration. Nathan was a puzzle, one she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. But for the first time she began to wonder if there was more to him than the arrogance and control that defined him. As she returned to her painting, her thoughts lingered on his words. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to understand him. But she wasn't ready to let her guard down, not yet. That evening, Emma sat in her room, replaying her conversation with Nathan in the art studio. His mention of his mother had caught her off guard. It was a rare moment of vulnerability, a crack in the carefully constructed facade he always wore. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than he let on, but she reminded herself not to get too comfortable. Trusting him too much could backfire. The next morning, Emma woke to find another note slipped under her door. "Be ready by noon. We're going into the city." The message was terse as usual, offering no explanation. She frowned but got ready, curious about what Nathan had planned. By the time she made it to the foyer, Nathan was already waiting by the door. He glanced at her, his gaze briefly scanning her outfit, a simple but elegant blouse and trousers. "Good. Let's go," he said, motioning for her to follow. As the car sped through the city, Emma broke the silence. "Are you going to tell me what this is about, or do I just have to guess?" Nathan smirked faintly but didn't answer immediately. "It's a meeting," he said finally. "You'll see when we get there." Emma sighed, leaning back in her seat. He was as infuriatingly cryptic as ever. The car pulled up in front of a sleek, modern building, its glass exterior gleaming in the sunlight. Nathan led Emma inside, where they were greeted by a receptionist who immediately directed them to a conference room on the top floor. The room was spacious and luxurious, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a stunning view of the city. Inside, a group of executives was already seated, their attention immediately shifting to Nathan as he entered. Emma followed him, feeling out of place but determined not to let it show. Nathan introduced her briefly, his tone polite but distant. "This is Emma," he said simply, offering no further context. The meeting began, and Emma quickly realized they were discussing a new business venture Nathan was investing in. She listened intently, trying to make sense of the jargon and numbers being thrown around. Occasionally, she caught Nathan glancing at her, as if gauging her reaction. When the meeting ended, Nathan turned to her as they exited the room. "What did you think?" Emma hesitated, unsure if he genuinely wanted her opinion. "It was interesting," she said cautiously. "You're taking a big risk with that investment?" Nathan raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "And what makes you say that?" Emma shrugged. "You're betting on something that isn't fully developed yet. It could pay off, but it could just as easily fail." Nathan studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then to her surprise he smiled, a real one, not the smug smirk she was used to. "Not bad. You've been paying attention." Emma blinked, unsure how to respond. "I guess." On the ride back to the mansion, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Nathan was testing her, though she couldn't figure out why. He seemed to be watching her more closely lately, as if he were trying to understand her just as much as she was trying to figure him out. When they arrived, Nathan paused before heading to his study. "You surprised me today," he said over his shoulder. "Keep it up." Emma watched him go, her emotions conflicted. For all his arrogance and control, Nathan was starting to show glimpses of something else, something she couldn't yet define. She didn't trust him, not completely, but she couldn't deny that he intrigued her. As she made her way back to her room, Emma found herself wondering what the next few weeks would bring. She had entered this arrangement with no expectations, but now she wasn't so sure. The lines between obligation and curiosity were starting to blur, and she wasn't sure how to feel about it. The next day, Emma decided to spend her morning in the art studio. Painting had become her refuge in the vast, intimidating mansion. As she worked on a new piece, a serene landscape, she felt a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in years. It was her way of reclaiming a part of herself, even amidst the chaos of her current situation. Later, she ventured downstairs to find Nathan speaking with one of the staff near the front door. His sharp, commanding tone softened slightly when he noticed her. "Emma," he said, turning his attention to her. "We're hosting a small dinner tomorrow night. A few important clients. I'll need you there." Emma frowned. "You're not giving me much of a choice, are you?" Nathan smirked faintly. "No, I'm not. But you'll do fine." With that, he left, leaving Emma standing in the grand foyer, her thoughts racing. She couldn't help but wonder why he kept involving her in these events. Was it just part of the bet, or was there something more? The following evening, Emma found herself seated at the head of an elegant dining table alongside Nathan and a group of impeccably dressed guests. The conversation flowed easily around her, though she spoke little. Nathan occasionally glanced her way, offering subtle nods of encouragement. By the end of the night, one of the clients turned to Nathan and said, "Your wife has quite the presence. You're lucky to have her." Nathan's smirk faded for a brief moment, replaced by an expression Emma couldn't quite read. "Yes," he said simply, his gaze lingering on her. "I suppose I am." Emma felt her chest tighten. She didn't know what to make of his words or the strange mix of emotions behind them. But one thing was certain. This arrangement was becoming far more complicated than she had anticipated. The morning after the dinner, Emma found herself reflecting on Nathan's words from the night before. "I suppose I am." The way he had said it, subdued, almost genuine, stuck with her. She didn't want to read too much into it, but it was hard to ignore the shift in his tone. Determined not to let it distract her, she headed to the library to clear her mind. As she browsed the shelves, Nathan appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. "You're up early," he remarked. Emma glanced at him, her expression neutral. Couldn't sleep. Nathan stepped into the room, his usual air of confidence tempered by something quieter. About last night? You handled yourself well? Emma arched an eyebrow. Is that another one of your half-compliments? Nathan smirked faintly. Take it however you want. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken thoughts hanging between them. Finally, Nathan broke the tension. There's an event in the city tomorrow. I'd like you to come with me. Emma frowned. Another one? Why do you keep dragging me into these things? Nathan's expression softened slightly, though his voice remained steady. Because you're part of this now. Whether you like it or not. Emma sighed but didn't argue. She had learned by now that resisting Nathan only got her so far. Fine, she said, crossing her arms. But I expect you to explain what's going on this time. Nathan chuckled softly, nodding. Fair enough. As he left the room, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Nathan's walls were slowly coming down, and that hers might be too. The next evening, Emma found herself in another unfamiliar setting, a prestigious art gallery in the heart of the city. Nathan had chosen a simple but elegant black dress for her to wear, and though she felt out of place, she reminded herself to keep her composure. This wasn't the first time she'd been thrust into his world, and it wouldn't be the last. As they entered the gallery, Nathan guided her through the crowd with ease, his hand resting lightly on her back. The space was filled with wealthy patrons, their conversations blending with the soft classical music in the background. Emma's eyes wandered to the walls, where paintings and sculptures from various artists were on display. You might like this one, Nathan said, stopping in front of a vibrant landscape painting. Emma glanced at him, surprised by the comment. He rarely spoke about art, let alone showed an interest in her preferences. It's beautiful, she admitted, studying the brushstrokes. Do you actually like it, or are you just guessing? Nathan smirked. Maybe both. Their conversation was interrupted by a gallery curator who approached Nathan with a wide smile. Mr. Greer, so glad you could make it, he said before turning to Emma. And you must be his wife. A pleasure to meet you. Emma forced a polite smile, still adjusting to the title. It's nice to meet you. As Nathan spoke with the curator, Emma noticed a few guests casting curious glances in their direction. She couldn't help but feel scrutinized, as though everyone was trying to figure out how she fit into Nathan's life. Later in the evening, as they sipped champagne near one of the exhibits, Nathan turned to her. You're doing well, he said, his tone low enough that only she could hear. Emma tilted her head. I didn't realize I was being graded. You always are, he replied with a hint of amusement. But you're exceeding expectations. Emma rolled her eyes, but she couldn't hide the faint smile tugging at her lips. Despite her initial resistance, she was beginning to understand this world, and, to her surprise, herself. As the night wore on, she found herself engaging more confidently in conversations, even offering thoughtful remarks about the artwork. Nathan stayed close by, his presence steady but unobtrusive. For the first time, Emma felt like she wasn't just surviving these events, she was starting to thrive. On the way back to the mansion, the car was quiet, save for the hum of the engine. Emma stared out the window, the city lights blurring past. Nathan finally broke the silence. You surprised me tonight, he said. Emma turned to him, raising an eyebrow. That's becoming a theme with you. Nathan smiled faintly, his expression unreadable. Maybe. Though his response was vague, Emma couldn't help but feel that she had made progress, not just in navigating Nathan's world but in understanding him. And, perhaps, in him understanding her. The next morning, Emma felt a strange sense of accomplishment. The gallery event had been a success, and for the first time she hadn't felt completely out of place. She spent the early hours in the art studio, letting her thoughts spill onto the canvas in vibrant colors and bold strokes. It was becoming her way of processing everything, the whirlwind of events, Nathan's unpredictable behavior, and her own shifting emotions. Around midday, she was surprised to find Nathan waiting for her in the studio doorway. He leaned against the frame, his arms crossed, watching her paint. You're spending a lot of time in here, he remarked. Emma set down her brush and turned to him. It's the one place in this house that feels mine. Nathan nodded, his expression unreadable. I wanted to talk to you about something. Emma raised an eyebrow. What is it? He stepped further into the room, his tone unusually serious. There's a charity event next week, something more formal than the gallery. I need you to prepare for it. Emma sighed. Another event? Don't you ever get tired of these things? Nathan smirked faintly. They're part of the job. And now they're part of yours. She crossed her arms, meeting his gaze. You keep saying this is all about the bet, but sometimes it feels like there's more to it. Nathan's expression flickered, but he recovered quickly. Maybe there is. Or maybe you're just overthinking. Emma narrowed her eyes. You're impossible. Nathan chuckled softly. You've told me that before. The rest of the day passed quietly. Emma spent most of it reflecting on Nathan's cryptic comments. She was starting to notice moments where his carefully crafted facade slipped, revealing glimpses of someone more complex. It frustrated her to no end that he refused to let his guard down completely. By the time dinner rolled around, Emma joined Nathan in the dining room. The staff had prepared a smaller, more intimate meal, and for once, there were no guests or formalities. The quiet was almost unsettling. As they ate, Nathan broke the silence. You've adapted faster than I expected. Emma looked up, surprised. What's that supposed to mean? You've handled yourself well at these events, Nathan said, leaning back in his chair. You're learning how to navigate this world? Emma frowned. I'm surviving it. That's different. Nathan studied her for a moment, his expression softening. Maybe. But you're stronger than you think. His words caught her off guard and she didn't know how to respond. Instead, she focused on her plate, letting the quiet settle over them again. That night, as Emma lay in bed, she replayed their conversation in her mind. Nathan's words had been unexpected, almost kind. It made her wonder if he saw something in her that she couldn't see in herself. But she quickly pushed the thought aside. No matter how much progress they seemed to make, she couldn't forget why she was here, or who Nathan really was. The next morning, Emma awoke to find another note slipped under her door. Be ready by noon. We're heading out. No further explanation as usual. She sighed, the routine of Nathan's cryptic instructions becoming oddly familiar. The next morning, Emma found herself lingering in the art studio, her thoughts unsettled by the conversation she'd had with Nathan the night before. His words had been raw, vulnerable even, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was seeing a side of him that few ever did. As she worked on a new piece, the sound of footsteps behind her pulled her from her thoughts. Nathan stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets. You've been spending a lot of time in here, he said, his tone lighter than usual. Emma wiped her hands on a rag and turned to face him. It's the only place in this house that feels mine. Nathan's smirk softened. Then it's yours for as long as you're here. His comments surprised her, and for a moment they stood in silence. Finally, Emma broke it. Why are you being nice to me? Nathan raised an eyebrow. Am I not allowed to be? You're not exactly known for it, Emma replied, folding her arms. Nathan chuckled softly. Fair point. Maybe I'm trying something new. Later that evening, back at the mansion, Nathan invited Emma to join him for dinner. It was the first time she'd seen the room fully lit, its dark wood paneling and shelves of books giving it a cozy, lived-in feel. Nathan handed her a glass of wine and gestured for her to sit by the fireplace. I thought you might enjoy this, he said, taking the seat across from her. Emma raised an eyebrow. What's the occasion? No occasion, Nathan replied, his tone casual. Just figured we could talk. Emma sipped her wine, eyeing him curiously. You've been different lately. More open. Nathan leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. Maybe you're rubbing off on me? She smiled, though her tone was serious. Or maybe you're finally letting yourself be who you are. Nathan didn't respond right away, his expression distant. It's not easy to let your guard down. Especially when you've spent your whole life building it up. Emma nodded, understanding more than she wanted to admit. I get that. But sometimes it's worth it. Nathan looked at her, his eyes searching hers as if trying to decide whether to trust her with the truth. You're different from anyone I've ever met, Emma. You don't care about the money or the image. You see things for what they are. She felt her chest tighten at his words, unsure how to respond. The intensity in his gaze was disarming, and for a moment she felt as though the walls between them had completely disappeared. The next morning, Nathan invited Emma to join him for a visit to the community center. This time, Emma felt more connected to the experience, helping children with their art projects and seeing the joy on their faces. It was a reminder of how far she had come, and how much she wanted to continue making a difference. As they left, Nathan looked at her with a rare, genuine smile. You've made an impact on them. Emma met his gaze, her voice soft. So have you. You should let people see that side of you more often. Nathan didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Something had shifted between them and Emma could feel it. That evening, Nathan surprised Emma by inviting her to join him for a quiet drink in the study. They sat by the fireplace, the warmth of the flames creating an intimate atmosphere. You've changed, Emma said, breaking the silence. In a good way. Nathan smirked. Maybe you're just seeing the real me? Emma tilted her head. Maybe. Or maybe you're finally letting yourself be real. Nathan's expression softened, and for a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the unspoken connection between them stronger than ever. The next day, Emma and Nathan spent time walking through the mansion gardens. The conversation was light, but Emma couldn't help noticing how relaxed Nathan seemed. The weight he usually carried appeared lighter, his demeanor more open. You're different, Emma said at one point, smiling. I like this version of you. Nathan looked at her, his voice quiet. I like this version of me too. On the final evening of their arrangement, Nathan set up a simple dinner on the terrace overlooking the gardens. As they ate, he finally spoke the words Emma hadn't expected. I don't want this to end. Emma looked at him, her heart racing. Nathan? He reached across the table, taking her hand. You've changed me, Emma. And for the first time in years, I feel like I have something real to hold on to. Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled. Then let's see where this goes. Together. True transformation begins when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable and open to change. Nathan and Emma's journey reminds us that while wealth and power may provide comfort, it's authenticity, connection, and love that bring true fulfillment.